welcome back to my channel. So today we are going to be reading The Value of Creativity, the story of Thomas Edison, and this value tale is told by Donegan Johnson. So without further ado, let's just get right into it. The Value of Creativity. This tale is about a very creative person, Thomas Edison. The story that follows is based on the events in his life. More historical facts about Thomas Edison can be found on page 63. Once upon a time, more than 100 years ago, a little boy named Thomas Alva Edison lived with his parents in the small town of Millen, Ohio. Tom was a lively child. Perhaps he was too lively. He was always taking things apart and putting them together again, or trying to put them together. "Good night," said his father one day. "Look at this, another broken toy." Now don't be hard on him," said his mother. "He only wants to see how things work." But one day, even Tom's mother lost her patience. That was the day Tom decided to find out what would happen if he kindled a little fire in the corner of the barn. What happened was the barn caught on fire. Tom's neighbors came running with buckets of water to put out the blaze. And Tom trembled. "I'm really in for it now," he thought. Indeed, Tom was in for it. The next day, Tom's father marched the boy down to the village square. There, in front of all the townspeople, Mr. Edison gave Tom a thorough whipping. "No," cried Tom, "please stop. That's enough." "I'll decide when you've had enough," shouted Mr. Edison. "I'll see that you remember this for a long, long time." Tom did remember the whipping. He never forgot it, but he didn't let it stop him from taking things apart to see how they worked. He didn't let it stop him from trying to do things in new ways. "He's a creative little fellow, isn't he?" said a neighbor after Tom's mother found him sitting on a nest in the neighbor's barn, trying to hatch some geese from eggs he had found there. His mother laughed. "It's always interesting," she said. "I only wish he didn't get into so much trouble." One day, Tom came home to find his parents in the parlor. His father looked very serious, and his mother was dabbing her eyes with her apron. "Mother, you're crying," said Tom. "What's the matter?" "Your mother is a bit upset, Tom," said his father. "I've just told her that we'll have to move. I did hope that the railroad would come to Millen, and business would pick up, but that isn't going to happen. No one is building new houses, and I can't make enough money to keep my lumber mill open." Tom felt a strange heaviness inside himself when he heard this. "Move," he said. "Move where? Where will we go?" "To Port Huron, Michigan," said Mr. Edison. "I can get work there." Tom knew there was no point in arguing. His father had to make a living. Just the same, Tom felt lonely. He would have to leave the only home he had ever known. He would have to say goodbye to all of his friends. "I wish I could take just one playmate with me," he whispered to himself. "Or a pet. Maybe if I had a pet, it would help." Tom shut his eyes and tried to imagine that he did have a pet, a fluffy dog with long ears and a waggly tail. And when Tom opened his eyes, there was a dog. "Oh boy," cried Tom, "am I dreaming? Are you really there?" "Well now," said the dog, "let's just say that I'm here as long as you believe I'm here. It's up to you. You imagined me, didn't you? You dreamed me up out of nothing. I guess we could say you created me." "You can talk," said Tom. "Hey, that's great. I'm going to call you Sparky Watts. Do you like that?" Not bad, said the dog. At least it's more original than Rover or Spot. Now, what's all this about being lonely in Port Huron? Don't you know that things won't be so different there? You can take all the really important things with you. You can take your imagination, your creativity, and you can take me. Tom knew that this was true. He knew, too, when Sparky Watts talked to him that way, it was really his own good sense talking. He cheered up immediately, and he helped his mother pack for the move. When he got to Port Huron, he helped her unpack again in the big white house near the lake. This won't be bad at all, said Tom to Sparky. Look how close we are at the water. I can go fishing every day to the water. Not quite, said his mother. You're a big boy now, Tom. It's time you went to school. The next day, Mr. Edison took Tom to the school that was run by the Reverend England and his wife. There, Tom was told to sit still on a hard bench and to pay attention. He was also told that he would have to memorize dates and places of names and words in the spelling lessons and sums in the arithmetic book. This is terrible, Tom told himself. I don't think I can learn anything this way. Tom began to wriggle and fidget in his seat. He let his imagination roam free. He pictured himself and his little make-believe friend, Sparky Watts, racing through the fields and swimming in the lake. When the Reverend England called on Tom to recite, Tom didn't answer. He was so busy daydreaming that he hadn't even heard his teacher. The boy is completely addled, said the Reverend England after Tom had been in school for 3 months. Tom heard that, and he didn't like it. He got up and ran out of school and back to his house. Addled, said Mrs. Edison when she heard what had happened. Nobody is going to call my boy addled. I think I'm saying that right. From now on, he'll stay home, and I'll teach him myself. Tom's mother worked with him for hours each day, and she taught him to love reading. Tom was 9 when his parents gave him a copy of Parker's Natural Experimental Philosophy. It was a book about science, and Tom thought it was marvelous. He decided immediately that he would be a scientist, and he set up a laboratory in his basement. What's he doing down there? demanded his father one day. It can't be good for a grown boy to spend all his time in the dark, damp cellar. I know, said his mother. It does worry me a little. You never know what he's up to. Of course he's clever and original, and don't tell me, said his father. He's creative. No sooner were the words out of Mr. Edison's mouth when there was an explosion in the cellar that fairly rocked the house. I was making a cannon, said Tom when his mother and father came dashing down the cellar stairs. Tell me again how creative he is, said Mr. Edison to Tom's mother. Tom, stop that this minute, scolded Mrs. Edison. Not another cannon, ever. Do you understand? So Tom gave up his attempt to create firearms, and he decided to experiment with his static electricity instead. Cats have lots of static electricity in their fur, he said to Sparky. Sometimes they give off sparks when you stroke them. Now if I fasten 2 cats together with wire and then... Don't do it, warned Sparky. But Tom did find 2 tomcats and did attach them to wires. Then he rubbed their tails together. The cats suddenly began hissing, screaming, scratching whirlwinds of fur. Tom and Sparky ran for their lives. That wasn't too smart, said Sparky when they stopped running at last. You never know till you try, said Tom cheerfully. Yes, you do, said Sparky. With cats, you know. Cats don't like being handled that way. But Tom wasn't listening. Tom had spotted his friend Michael Oates. Michael was strolling down the street whistling. He looked like a boy with time on his hands. Michael, called Tom, have you ever wanted to fly? To fly? Michael blinked and thought about this. I guess it might be fun, he said. I don't know why people have these accents, okay? I've been reading about the way balloons go up in the air, said Tom. They fly because they're full of gas. Now, if you took a bunch of seidlitz powders, you'd have lots of gas in your stomach. Then maybe you'd be able to fly, just like a balloon. Michael looked doubtful, but he trailed after Tom towards the basement laboratory. I have a feeling this isn't going to work worth the dawn, said Sparky Watson, trotted along behind the boys. Sparky was right. Michael took the oh yeah, here's this picture. And then this is what we're on. The powders and didn't fly. He ran home with a stomachache, and Tom got a spanking from his mother. All right, said Tom when the excitement had died down. So it didn't work. Not everything does. But I've been reading about a new invention called a telegraph, and I'm going to build a telegraph, and I'll bet it will work. Oh wait, this is Tom. All right, said Tom with the excitement had died down. So it didn't work. Not everything does, but I've been reading about a new invention called the telegraph. I'm going to build a telegraph, and I bet it will work. Great, said Sparky Watts, but this time try to figure out what you're doing before you do it. You'll need to know about electricity, and I don't mean the kind you make by rubbing two cats together. Tom knew that Sparky Watts was right. He got all the books he could find about electricity and began to study. When he felt that he understood the subject, he set to work, together with his friend Jim Clancy. The boys strung wires on the trees from Tom's house to Jim's. They got batteries and electromagnets and all sorts of gear, and when everything was ready, each boy went to his own house. Tom tapped at the telegraph key, and Jim heard the long and short noises of the code. Tom was tapping out the word, hello. Wonderful, said Sparky Watts. And you notice that nothing exploded? Not even once. When he was 12, Tom heard that there was a job opening on the train that ran from Port Huron to Detroit. When he was 12. Okay, Detroit, Michigan. The trainman needed a boy to sell candy and sandwiches to the passengers. Mother, can I go? Said Tom. I can make money to help you and Dad, and I'll have some left over to buy chemicals and equipment for my laboratory. Mrs. Edison frowned. You're too young, she said. Besides, you'll fall behind in your lessons. No, I won't, declared Tom. I'll study on the train while we're in the station in Detroit. Let him do it, said Mr. Edison. He's big enough. It won't hurt him to get out and earn his keep. At 12 years old, guys. So it was settled. 2 days later, Tom was on the station. At 7 in the morning, he had a huge basket piled high with food and magazines and newspapers. When the train pulled out of the station, Tom walked through the cars with his basket. Candy, he called out, magazines, nuts, sandwiches. Here, boy, cried a passenger. I'll have a sandwich, said a second passenger. Tom's food and his magazines and newspapers were soon sold, and he could sit and read the science book he had brought from home. That should make your mother happy, said Sparky. What are you reading about now and that? And what new experiments are you going to try when you get home? I'm not sure, said Tom, but there'll be experiments nobody's ever tried before. Before long, Tom began doing experiments in the half-empty baggage car aboard the train. He fixed a workbench there, and he brought his chemicals from home so that he could go on with his own work when he wasn't busy peddling sandwiches and candy. This seems like a disaster, waiting to happen. One day, Tom was late getting to the station. The train was ready to pull out, and Tom had to run with his arms full of newspapers. The train began to move, and Tom put out a hand and grabbed at the railing next to the steps of the car. He caught it, but he couldn't pull himself up. Hang on, cried the conductor. I'll help you. He reached out, caught Tom by the ears, and pulled him aboard the train. Tom stood on the platform of the train and shook his head. His ears were ringing, and in a few seconds they began to hurt. He could see that the conductor was talking to him, but he couldn't hear what the man said. Tom had trouble with earaches and colds, and now the tug the conductor had given him had really damaged his ears. He was beginning to go deaf. Soon, Tom was unable to hear the birds sing. He could not hear his friends when they laughed together. He tried not to be unhappy, and he filled the growing silence with reading, with experiments in his laboratory, with peddling his wares on the train, and with his new venture, a newspaper. Tom had seen that newspapers were very important to his customers and decided to publish his own paper. He bought an old printing press and put it into the baggage car near his workbench. His newspaper, Grand Trunk Herald, was the first newspaper ever published aboard a train. Tom thought publishing was great fun, and before long he went into partnership with a young friend who worked at the newspaper in Port Huron. The two decided to put out a gossip sheet called Paul Pry. Tom, be careful, warned Sparky. Gossip can be dangerous. Once it starts, you have no way of telling how it will end. But Tom and his friend were too excited to be careful, and their new paper was popular from the start. People bought it so that they could chuckle while they read the little stories about their neighbors. Of course, Tom and his friends didn't print people's names. They really didn't want to harm anyone, but they only used initials. But when they printed an item that said that a young man named F had better keep out of J.W.'s saloon, Doctor in Port Huron thought they were writing about his son. "Where's the editor?" cried the doctor, bursting into the place. "Where is the editor?" cried the doctor, bursting into the place where Tom and his friend were sitting, type for the next edition of their paper. "Wait till I get my hands on him. I'll throw him in the lake." Of course, Tom didn't say he was the editor. He didn't say much of anything, but when the doctor had stormed away, he decided in the future he'd be more careful. "You're right," he told Sparky. "Gossip is dangerous. It may have hurt the man's son, and surely could have hurt me." If you ever end up doing this, guys, just change their name completely. Don't do initials. Tom eventually lost interest in his newspaper, but he never lost interest in his experiments. He kept working in his traveling laboratory until the day the train bumped over a rough spot on the track and some jars tumbled off a high shelf, crashing onto the floor. "Tom, watch out!" cried Spikey. One of the jars had contained phosphorus and burst into flames. See, this was never smart from the start. "What's going on here?" cried the conductor as he rushed into the baggage car. Tom didn't answer. He was busy trying to put out the fire. The conductor pitched in and helped him. They beat down the flames. When the train reached the next stop, the conductor heaved Tom's workbench and his collection of chemicals out the door. "Don't you ever let me see any of those bottles on my train again," he shouted. After that, Tom did his experimenting at home in Port Huron. When he had time to spare on the train, he read or napped. Sometimes when the train stopped at Mount Clemens, Michigan, he got off and talked with Mr. Mackenzie, who ran the telegraph office there. One day, Tom swung off the train and saw that Mr. Mackenzie's little boy had wandered onto the railroad tracks. The boxcar was rolling toward the child. Tom raced to scoop up the boy off the tracks and out of the way of the rolling car. Mr. Mackenzie was so grateful that he hardly knew how to thank Tom. "Perhaps I could teach you telegraphy," he said. "Would you like to learn?" "You bet I would," said Tom. From then on, he left the train every day at Mount Clemens and learned to send and receive on Mr. Mackenzie's telegraph instruments. Little kids coming up the stairs. Tom was 16 when he got his first real job. He was made a night telegrapher and a station agent. The job was across the Canadian border in Stratford, Ontario. Tom wasn't working in Stratford long before he had trouble. He found he had developed the habit of taking cat naps on the train, and now he found that he couldn't stay awake all night. "Maybe it would help if you slept in the daytime," said Sparky. "Don't be silly," said Tom. "I have to read in the daytime and study and work on my experiments. And Tom rigged up one of his first practical inventions. It was a device that would send a signal to his boss every half an hour. Even if Tom dropped off to sleep, the signal would go out and the boss would think that Tom was awake and alert. But sleeping on the job is a serious matter, especially for someone who is a station agent and a telegrapher. Tom's boss discovered what was happening, and Tom's days in Stratford were over. For the next few years, Tom wandered about from city to city, Telegraph operators were needed everywhere, and Tom could usually find work. However, he couldn't hold on to a job very long. He was too interested in reading and experimenting and sketching and planning. He wanted to create new inventions, to build things that no one had ever thought of before. He would neglect to take down incoming messages, or he would let outgoing messages pile up. Then suddenly he would be out of work once again. Being creative is very nice. Said Sparky at last. But there's nothing wrong with eating either. Do you suppose you can manage to pay attention for a while so we could get some money ahead? All right, said Tom. I'll pay attention and we'll go to Boston. That's the center of scientific learning. I can work there and keep up with things that are going on in the world of science. Maybe I'll create something that's really needed. Maybe, said Sparky. Up till now, you've just been amusing yourself. You know that, don't you? Tom didn't like to admit this, but he knew it was true. He took Sparky's words to heart, and when he reached Boston, he got a job as a telegrapher for Western Union. For a while, he did pay attention, and things went better than they usually did. After a while, however, Tom decided that a job wasn't really what he should have. What I should really do is make a fortune, he said. Then I wouldn't have to worry about jobs at all. A lovely idea, but is it practical? Said Sparky. We'll soon find out, said Tom, and he set to work on an invention that believed was really necessary. It was an automatic voice vote recorder, and Tom planned to persuade members of Congress to use it. Then, instead of taking the time to stand and vote aye or nay on the measures that were submitted to Congress, the lawmakers in Washington could simply flip a switch at their desk, and their votes would be recorded at the desk of the speaker. They're bound to like it, said Tom when his recorder was ready. Look how efficient it is. The entire Congress can vote in just a few minutes. Tom quit his job and went to Washington. Were the legislators interested in his invention? They were not. They didn't care whether they were efficient or not. They sent Tom on his way as lean and hungry as ever. Sparky and Tom went to New York, and Tom happened to be at the Gold Exchange the day the indicator broke down. The gold indicator was much like the stock ticker we know today, a sort of telegraph sent out information on gold prices, offices, brokers all over New York. One day, the indicator broke and the tickets began to run wild. In no time, people crowded in the gold room shouting, "Fix the machine, fix it, fix it." No one could do this until Tom Edison stepped forward. In just an hour or two, he had the indicator running perfectly again. At last, Tom's talents were appreciated. In the months that followed, Tom improved the gold indicators. He invented a device that would stop all ticket machines in the broker's offices and central transmitter should break down again. This way, there won't be such a panic, he told Sparky. The officials of the indicator company were delighted with Tom's creation. They were happy to pay him $40,000 for his invention. "My stars," said Sparky as they hurried to the bank with the check. I've never seen so much money in my entire life. What are you going to do with it, Tom?" "I'm going to go into business myself," Tom declared. "I'll never have to worry about jobs and bosses again." Entrepreneur! And Tom, who was just 23 years old, opened a workshop and laboratory in Newark, New Jersey. He began to hire assistants to help him. "I want to fix things so that the world can run on electricity," Tom told Sparky. "It will be a big job, and I can't do it alone." Have I shown this picture yet? I lose track. It was just at this time that Tom met a very pretty girl named Mary Stilwell. She worked at the Gold and Stock Company punching perforations into telegraph tape. Once he had seen her, Tom himself did very little work. Instead, he haunted the Gold and Stock Company. He stood near Mary and stared at her with admiration. The other employees laughed when they saw Tom, and they teased Mary about him. She was flustered and embarrassed. One day, when this had been going on for some time, Tom went to Mary and said rather bluntly, "Will you marry me?" Alrighty, he's just going for this. Mary was only 16. She was startled and almost frightened. She didn't know how to answer. However, she did like this bright, creative young man, and on Christmas Day in 1971, the two were married. I gotta sneeze. Alright, we're moving on. If she was only 16, he was 23. So I guess... Excuse me. There's like a 7-year age gap. Possibly 8. The day after his marriage, Tom went back to work, and in the years that followed, there was a great explosion of creative energy. Tom was constantly designing devices that would improve telegraphy. It sounds like I'm saying calligraphy. Telegraphy. It just sounds wrong. He also improved the telephone, which Alexander Graham Bell had invented. Alexander Graham Bell's story is really cool. If you ever get to watch anything on him, you should do it. In 1876, when he was 29, Edison moved his workshop from Newark to Menlo Park, New Jersey. At Menlo Park, he announced he was working on a talking machine. You mean you're going to save us the trouble of talking for ourselves?" laughed one of Edison's assistants. The man soon learned what Tom meant. He watched Tom wrap tinfoil around the cylinder of a strange little machine. When Tom turned a crank on the machine and began to recite, "Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow." As Tom recited, a pointed instrument moved on the machine, and when Tom stopped reciting and turned the machine back to its starting place, the assistant heard Tom's voice again. This time, it came from the machine. Tom had invented the phonograph, and it was to become one of his most beloved creations. That's going to need to be fixed. But it was not the phonograph for which Thomas Alva Edison is best known. It is his invention of a new kind of electric light that really changed the world. Until Tom figured out how to make them, there were no light bulbs like the ones we use today. For all time before them, people had only the glow from fireplaces, candles, oil or gas lamps, or other open flames to give light at night and brighten dark places. Tom Edison began working on his great invention in 1878. When he started, he knew that he and his helpers had a very difficult problem to solve. "We have to find a way to use electricity to make a lamp that will glow, but won't melt or burn up," he told his staff of dedicated assistants. "Golly," said Sparky Watts, "are you sure you even want to try this one?" Remember, Tom, Sparky went on, "many famous scientists, people who know all about light and electricity work, have tried to make such a lamp, and none of them could do it. Maybe you should read what they have written about this very difficult problem before you spend a lot of time and money on experiments that might not work." Here's their little team meeting. See, it's a little broken. I'll glue it today. "That could just get in my way," said Tom. "When I start on an invention, I don't read books. I don't want to know what has already been done. I start from scratch." Tom didn't know all the rules about light and electricity that the scientists knew, but he did know that to create something brand new, you had to work long and hard. He knew you had to try all sorts of new ways to do something no one had ever done before. That was the secret of coming up with a great invention. That was the secret of creativity. I'll read that again. He knew that you had to try all sorts of new ways to do something no one had ever done before. That was the secret of coming up with a great invention. That was the secret of creativity. And in the months that followed, Tom Edison and his helpers worked very hard indeed. They worked day and night When they were exhausted, they curled up on tables and in chairs to snatch a few winks of sleep. Then they woke to work some more. Tom knew their task involved several problems. The new kind of lamp would need a glass globe to hold the light. They had to find a way to make the globe strong enough so it wouldn't shatter. Tom even hired a skilled glassblower from Germany to make better globes. They had to make special pumps to draw the air from globes because the part of the new lamp that glowed, the filament, would burn up in the air. Finally, Tom knew the most important thing was finding just the right material for the filament of his new light, and that was the hardest part. Tom and his assistants tried all sorts of filaments. One after another they inserted into the glass globe, and one after another when the electricity heated the filaments to make them glow, they burned or melted, or the globes exploded. In 1979, after months of labor and thousands of experiments, Tom Edison found a thin carbon filament that worked. He had succeeded in creating a lamp that glowed with a steady, bright, long-lasting light. His creativity had produced a new kind of light called incandescent. Wow. Light, in which a current of electricity passed through a fine filament inside a glass globe and gave off lots of light but little heat. After inventing his great new lamp, Tom went on to perfect an entire electrical system, generators, wiring, fuses, sockets, everything that would make it possible for everyone, everywhere, to have his electric lights. At the end of 1879, Tom presented his invention to the world. Literally in a year, he created one of the most life-changing things. But that's all he did. He just focused on one thing. So he's like the first electrician. Crowds flocked to Menlo Park to see the lights on the streets and lanes near Edison's laboratory. They were awed by the spectacle, and some predicted that the world would never be the same again. They called Edison the Wizard of Menlo Park. Soon kings and presidents and other famous and distinguished people were heaping honors on him. No doubt this pleased Edison. It would please anyone. But what pleased him even more was the knowledge that he had accomplished something really worthwhile, using only his creativity, his energy of mind, and his determination. Perhaps you are like Edison. Perhaps you're always trying new things, or you think of new ways of doing old things. Perhaps you like to make things up out of your head using your own original ideas. Of course, there isn't anything wrong with doing things the old way, the sure way that always works. But when you try new things, there's always a chance that it will turn out to be better ways. And if you try them, you may have more fun, and you may create wonderful things too, just like our good friend Thomas Edison. The end. So that is the end of the story, but I will go on to read the historical facts in a second. But some of my thoughts I have is that he is kind of like the first inventor entrepreneur, and I thought this is a really cool story. I don't know if I've ever read this ValueTale before, so this one was really fun to read, and I enjoyed it. So let's just get into the historical facts, so I don't take up any more of your precious time. So the historical facts. Thomas Alva Edison, the greatest and most prolific inventor of his time, was born in Millen, Ohio in 1847. He was the youngest child of Samuel and Nancy Elliott Edison. His mother, had been a school teacher and was determined that Thomas would be successful. She took full responsibility of his education and worked hard to instill him a love of reading. Edison began his working career as a newsboy of the Grand Trunk Railroad when he was only 12. His day aboard the train was long, and he quickly formed what was to be a lifelong habit. Whenever he was not busy, he would stretch out on a wooden bench and have a nap. Edison also read and studied on the train. He installed a laboratory in the baggage car and acquired a printing press and brought out the first newspaper ever published aboard a train. It was during this time that Edison's ears were damaged for life. No one is sure how this happened. There are many stories about it. According to some accounts, Edison's ears were injured when Fred tried to pull him aboard the train, and others that a conductor boxed his ears after a chemical fired in the baggage car. When he was 16, Edison became the night telegrapher and station agent at Stratford, Ontario. He quickly got in trouble, partly because he slept on the job and partly because he was involved in too many projects and could not keep his mind on his work. After he left Stratford, Edison wandered from city to city working as a telegrapher. He never kept a job long, and by the time he was 21, he was considered by family and friends to be a failure. However, he had spent his youthful years learning to experiment without being greatly inhibited by the failures of previous experimenters. He was stubborn, independent, and hardworking, and began to make his name by creating devices to improve the telegraph. One of the most notable of his early inventions was the quadruplex method, by which 4 messages could be sent simultaneously over the same wire. Quadruplex telegraph. As he gained backing, Edison expanded his horizons. Soon his inventions included the carbon telegraph, telephone, transmitter, and the phonograph. Edison's incandescent lamp was the first demonstrated in 1879. When the young inventor was only 32, along with the lamp, Edison developed an entire electrical system. In the years following his marvelous work, Edison devised a super storage battery and worked out a way to synchronize motion pictures and sound. Before his life ended, he was to hold more than 1,300 United States and foreign patents. His workshops and laboratories in Menlo Park in West Orange, New Jersey, were forerunners of the modern industrial laboratories where teams of experts tried to solve problems rather than leaving the formulation of new developments to chance and skill of individual inventors. Edison became a legend in his own time and was honored by distinguished men in science of industries who were his contemporaries. No doubt this delighted him, but what made him feel really fulfilled with knowledge that because of his tenacity and independence and his creative ability, the lives of people everywhere were improved and made easier. Thomas Alva Edison, 1847 to 1931. So he was 84 or 85 when he died, depending. 83 or 84. So thank you guys for tuning into The Value of Creativity, the story of Thomas Edison, told by Donegan Johnson. And I think it'd be so cool to have at least been on his team when this happened. So guys, I think it's just another thing to always take chances and risk with entrepreneurs, because you could end up creating something great alongside of them that goes down in history. So thank you for joining me, and I will see you guys for the next one. So maybe listen to one of these each day and subscribe and click the notification bell so that you guys can be notified every time I upload a new book. I will see you guys for the next one. Bye.